I'm Matt Gishard, and this is No Holds Barred. In today's episode, I want to talk about employer-employee relationships as it relates to political issues. When I talk about political issues at work, I'm often reminded of, around the water cooler, people talking about who they're going to vote for, who they're not going to vote for. But I really want to say it's critical. We hear about it every day about somebody lost his or her job because they voiced an opinion. They got into it. They got into a political discussion, and they took a position that perhaps most people at the company didn't take, whether it's a discussion of guns or who you're backing or who you're going to vote for, or in today's world, let's get right to it, what is happening in Gaza. Many, many people have lost their jobs over the years for voicing opinions or even engaging in conduct way back that perhaps was acceptable back then and is not acceptable now. What are the rules? What are the obligations? Do you have an obligation as an employee to respond when your boss asks you, so are you a Republican or are you a Democrat or what are you? And that's a very tricky question, because from a legal standpoint, your employer should not ask you that question, should not put you on the spot as to that. It's illegal to do that. It actually is. You don't ask them things like that. And you find yourself, so what do I do or what do I say? I want to get to something that is just incredibly troubling to everyone across our country and perhaps across the world. And that is looking at something like the Viet Nam War in 1968. Now, it didn't start in 68, it didn't end in 68, but that was a time of incredible ferment on college campuses and throughout the world. And over time, our country went from many people supporting the war effort to, as time went on, not supporting it, to campus uproar, to finally a president who decided not to run, not to accept the nomination because of the incredible pressure as a result of the Viet Nam War. And we look at that and say, from the perspective of today, certain those students who were on campus protesting and in some cases rioting had it right. They had it right. What they did, what they were protesting was the right thing. But we have to make a determination, and it happened back then and it's happening now, a determination as to what is in violation of the law, what is expressing your First Amendment rights as to something that disturbs you, as opposed to breaking something, trashing a building, burning a building down, trespassing, or whatever. And those two are clashing and clashed in many cases back in the 60s, the Vietnam War time. And again, today, we are visiting the same kind of thing, And let's not fool ourselves. There are people who are on both sides of the divide who are doing it for purposes other than simply voicing their opinions. There are certainly, as we used to see not very long ago in a number of our Northern California cities, what they called anarchists. They had Black and Antifa, and they were anarchists. They wanted to break things up. They weren't just there to protest. And we have some of that, we certainly do. But for the most part, what we want to be concerned about is, can an employer ask an employee, so how do you feel about what's happening in Gaza? How do you feel about Israel? How do you feel about this anti-Semitism that we seem to see all over? Well, those aren't fair questions, and they should not be asked. But let's say a hypothetical. A person says, there's a big protest out in front of City Hall in San Francisco today, and boss, I want to take the day off because I want to go to that protest. And in effect, that person is telling their boss that they feel a certain way, one way or another. And what if the employer is not in complete agreement with that and finds that changes the employer's opinion as to that particular employee, allows them that time off, and let's say they have a right to take off a certain number of days, and they take their days off. And then a month later, that employee, being an at-will state, gets fired. No reason given, don't have to give a reason. You're fired. Do they have a recourse? And again, we are talking out here on hypotheticals, but it is a very, very big issue. And we're going to see the same kinds of things happening as happened back in the 60s. And I can often say I'm sometimes puzzled because I can remember walking around the University of California, Berkeley in the 60s, and people were always saw there's that faint smell of tear gas in the air. And people would be out, there'd be all kinds of desks and tables and various organizations advocating for various things, and students running around and yelling and screaming and doing things in opposition to the war, among other things. And things were fairly calm. And then all of a sudden, out would come police in riot gear and wading into the crowds, and everything would blow up. And later on, they kind of learned the smartest thing to do was not do that. And around 1:30, when the students had to, the ones who had classes, had to go off to class, the things kind of quieted down and they dispersed, and there didn't have to be any arrests or anything. And I'm hopeful that we'll have the same kind of thing here fairly soon on our college campuses as it relates to what's happening in the Middle East. But getting back to what employers can do, in that hypothetical that I gave you, can that person who was fired later bring a case against the company for being fired for expressing her First Amendment rights, or just suggesting that she was going to express her First Amendment rights? And that's, I'd say that's a wait and see that we're going to have to see, because I suspect there's going to be a great deal of that coming out. I don't want to get into political issues as to what side of the divide different people are on, but clearly we have lots and lots of people who feel strongly one way or another. And we have some politicians expressing that everyone who's protesting should be arrested and should be expelled from school. And that's not going to happen, but we are going to get into a very big debate about how much somebody can express their thoughts, their opinions, what they want to have happen without fear, and that's what our First Amendment right is, without fear of losing their job or being arrested for simply expressing it. Now, breaking the law is something different, as we saw in Oakland a number of times not too many months ago, where people were breaking windows purposefully, crowds going and trashing stores, and we're seeing some of that now, going into classrooms and trashing the classrooms. Public safety issues, you can't do that. So you can't do that. So for those of you who feel strongly one way or another, and you want to go out and meet on a square somewhere and voice your opinion, you absolutely have a right to do that. Don't break the law. And if the police have asked you to disperse and have announced that it is an unlawful assembly for whatever reason, take note of that and disperse. That doesn't mean you can't have your feelings, but I want to caution those of you who are employers or employees. As to employees, you don't have to be questioned, and you shouldn't be questioned on it. As to employers, don't question people about their political beliefs or their sexual orientation or any of the protected classes. Don't do that, because all you're asking for is an incredible amount of trouble. And I will say, Some of this is a hyperbole, because some of it so far is not in these books that we're talking about. But in the future, I can quite assure you, there will be legislation to protect people in situations such as this. Thanks for watching this episode of No Holds Barred. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. And what I'd like to say about No Holds Barred is no hyperbole, no bullshit, just the law and the facts. The reason why we like you to hit the like button and the subscribe button is because it helps us with our YouTube rankings. The more people that do that, the more people will watch our episode, the more comments we get, the more questions we get, the higher we go in the rankings. It helps you, and it certainly helps us.